The extension of suffrage to women represents a pivotal moment in democratic development, frequently lauded as an advancement toward equality. However, an alternative analysis posits that women's electoral participation significantly alters male behavior, generating consequences for both interpersonal dynamics and societal structures. This perspective contends that women's voting power disrupts the equilibrium between genders, prompting men to forsake their inherent viewpoints in favor of female preferences. Men, motivated by the pursuit of relational and physical intimacy, adjust their political decisions to align with women's inclinations. This adaptation is argued to produce tension within personal relationships and broader governance frameworks. The central contention focuses on the transformation of male decision-making under female electoral influence. Men, traditionally associated with pragmatic reasoning, shift toward emotionally or relationally driven priorities to secure female approval. This reorientation amplifies women's impact on policy outcomes, as men prioritize relational harmony over independent analysis. Consequently, legislative measures, such as welfare expansion and labor regulations, emerge, which critics attribute to women's voting patterns and link to economic and social strain. This influence permeates beyond domestic spheres into political arenas. Elected officials, cognizant of women's voting strength, design platforms to appeal to female constituencies, often emphasizing issues that diverge from national imperatives. Women's preferences, which evolve across life stages, further complicate this process as men, both partners and policymakers, adapt to accommodate these variable demands. The argument suggests that women's suffrage introduces a dynamic wherein men's pursuit of approval drives legislative agendas, establishing a form of indirect authority that challenges traditional gender complementarity. This analysis delineates four dimensions of this phenomenon: the effect of women's voting on male cognition, men's conformity to preserve relational stability, politicians' responsiveness to female electoral power, and women's utilization of femininity to influence policy. Each section elucidates an aspect of the hypothesis that women's voting authority extends beyond mere participation, reshaping male behavior and national trajectories. This examination poses a foundational inquiry into democratic power structures. How do gender interactions configure the exercise of political agency? Women's electoral participation provides a mechanism to shape male thought processes. Men, driven by the desire for relational or physical closeness, modify their inherent perspectives to correspond with women's viewpoints. Historically, male logic and female empathy formed a complementary balance. With women's voting rights, men experience pressure to adopt feminine orientations to secure partnerships. This alteration disrupts the traditional equilibrium of gender roles. In relational contexts, a man might observe his partner's support for compassionate policies, such as robust social programs. To gain her favor, he aligns his vote with hers, even if his inclination favors restraint. He perceives this congruence as a pathway to relational success. However, women frequently disfavor this conformity, preferring partners who retain independent stances. Unaware, the man persists, assuming that mirroring her political choices enhances his prospects for closeness. This behavior aggregates across the electorate. Men seeking approval reinforce women's voting tendencies, contributing to policies that may not serve collective interests. Prohibition exemplifies this. Backed by women's votes and men's concurrence, it precipitated crime and economic difficulties. The argument posits that men's prioritization of intimacy over judgment enables women to guide outcomes indirectly. Men's ballots amplify women's preferences, establishing a cycle wherein female influence predominates. This cycle generates friction. Women vote according to their inclinations, men conform to maintain favor, and society absorbs the repercussions. Traditionally, male strength and female nurturing complemented each other. Now voting serves as a conduit for aligning male cognition with female priorities, often contrary to initial instincts. Whether women deliberately exert this influence or it arises from male impulses, the outcome persists. Men's political choices reflect women's preferences, reconfiguring democratic processes and straining gender balance. This alignment, rooted in relational motives, shifts decision-making foundations, prioritizing individual connections over societal outcomes. Within established relationships, men face heightened pressure to align with women's perspectives. To maintain harmony and ensure physical or emotional intimacy, men suppress their own beliefs to avoid discord. When a woman expresses displeasure, the man risks relational distance, prompting him to adopt her political positions. This behavior contrasts with historical norms, where men earned favor through independence and resilience rather than acquiescence. Consider a husband whose wife supports expansive welfare policies, while he leans toward limited government. Her dissatisfaction, manifested through tension or withdrawal, encourages him to vote with her. He assumes that preserving her contentment secures relational stability and closeness. However, women often disapprove of this compliance, valuing partners who exhibit conviction. The man, focused on peace, continues adapting, unaware of her underlying discontent. This pattern extends societally. Men, motivated to please partners, reinforce women's voting trends, entrenching policies that may undermine broader systems. The complementary dynamic, male resolve balancing female care, weakens as men prioritize female satisfaction. Women's electoral power grants them leverage, with relational rewards contingent on male agreement. This inverts traditional relational norms, where men demonstrated value through leadership rather than conformity. The outcome reveals a contradiction. Women, empowered by voting, expect male support for their views, yet grow frustrated when men comply. Men sacrifice principles for intimacy, assuming it fortifies bonds. Relationships and policies suffer consequently. Measures such as welfare expansion or labor restrictions, tied to this dynamic, contribute to economic challenges, with male conformity facilitating their adoption. Women's voting authority reshapes male behavior, transforming independent actors into followers of female preferences. This shift undermines the roles that once stabilized personal and public domains, replacing mutual balance with a one-sided influence driven by men's desire for relational harmony. Women's votes exert substantial influence over political actors, who tailor platforms to secure female support. These platforms often prioritize issues labeled as women's concerns, welfare, labor regulations, social programs, which some contend exacerbate societal conditions. Politicians target not only mature women but also 18-year-olds, whose limited experience informs demands misaligned with national priorities. This emphasis on youthful voters compels leaders to address immediate preferences over enduring stability. A candidate might appeal to teenage girls advocating free education or environmental measures. These young women, lacking comprehensive perspective, support initiatives that strain budgets or impede industry. Politicians, dependent on their votes, acquiesce, formulating commitments that favor electoral success over governance efficacy. This responsiveness extends beyond youth as women's preferences evolve. Childcare in early adulthood, healthcare in midlife, retirement benefits later. Men's political orientations remain more stable, yet politicians focus on women's fluctuating demands. Additionally, some women retain youthful mindsets into adulthood. A 50-year-old might pursue policies reflecting adolescent ideals, and politicians adjust to secure her vote. This variability contrasts with men's consistency, requiring leaders to navigate divergent female priorities. Historical cases like Prohibition, supported by women's votes and men's agreement, demonstrate the consequences, yielding crime and economic disruption. The contention holds that responding to women produces policies that destabilize rather than fortify society. This focus reconfigures governance. Politicians, reliant on female voters, address issues that shift with life stages or persist from immature perspectives, sidelining broader imperatives. Young women and older women with youthful outlooks guide decisions, while male voices recede. The electoral process becomes a negotiation with a diverse, dynamic female constituency, yielding outcomes that reflect immediate demands rather than unified strategy. Women's voting power drives politicians to prioritize their support, often at the expense of coherent, effective policy, redirecting leadership to align with female influence across age groups. Women employ femininity, appearance, vulnerability, traditional roles, to affect men and consequently policy. Men, responding with protective instincts, address these articulated needs, even when they fall outside governmental purview. Politicians, recognizing women's electoral strength, feign commitment to female concerns, while women leverage gender traits to secure outcomes favoring personal rather than collective interests. In practice, a woman might highlight her challenges, perhaps childcare expenses, prompting a man to respond, whether a partner or legislator. Men, inclined to assist, support policies to alleviate her difficulties, even if they burden systems. Women depend on this interaction, using emotional appeals or charm to obtain advantages. Politicians emulate this, promoting issues like healthcare or education that resonate with female voters, despite their tenuous link to essential governance functions. Men's protective disposition enhances this influence. A candidate might endorse welfare increases to assist women, reacting to their expressed needs rather than evaluating wider impacts. Women, while diverging from traditional roles elsewhere, invoke them here to gain leverage. This approach generates policies, welfare growth, labor protections, that some associate with economic decline, attributing them to men's responses to female signals rather than deliberate analysis. This process distorts policy frameworks. Issues framed as female priorities dominate discourse, though they frequently address individual rather than societal needs. Men, motivated to support or please, enable this shift, enacting measures women secure through femininity rather than reasoning. Traditional gender roles become instruments of influence, selectively applied to achieve objectives. The outcome is a government attuned to emotional appeals over structural necessities, propelled by male instincts and women's strategic use of identity. This interaction redirects resources and focus, crafting a system where female influence, grounded in gender dynamics, supersedes other considerations. Women's voting power affects men across personal and political domains, reshaping behavior and policy. Men adjust their cognition to align with women's preferences, seeking relational or physical closeness, while conforming in relationships to preserve stability. Politicians respond to female voters, from teenagers to adults, with evolving or youthful mindsets, producing policies that reflect these demands. Women utilize femininity to elicit men's protective responses, securing outcomes that prioritize individual needs over public welfare. Measures like prohibition, welfare expansion, and labor laws, connected to women's votes and men's concurrence, contribute to economic and social difficulties. In relationships, men adopt women's views, believing it ensures closeness, though women often disapprove of this compliance. Politicians target women's changing priorities, developing fragmented platforms that address immediate concerns rather than national stability. Women's use of charm or vulnerability prompts men to act, channeling resources into policies that may not align with governance's primary purpose. This influence, rooted in men's pursuit of approval and women's electoral authority, shifts gender balance, replacing complementarity with a dynamic where female preferences prevail. This analysis invites examination. Men cast their own votes, choosing to align with women rather than being obligated. Women's variable demands reflect human diversity, not inconsistency. Policies like prohibition emerged from collective choices, not solely female influence. Assumptions: men driven by intimacy, women by manipulation, overlook individual variation. Nevertheless, the perspective endures. Women's voting power, amplified by men's reactions, alters democracy's trajectory, yielding outcomes that challenge stability. Revoking suffrage remains a theoretical exercise, not a feasible proposal. The emphasis lies in understanding influence. If women's voting affects men's actions, the response involves men asserting independent judgment and politicians prioritizing collective needs. Democracy operates through competing interests, not unilateral dominance. Women's votes reshape gender interactions, and the results, whether advancement or disruption, depend on how men and leaders address this authority. This discussion highlights a reality. Suffrage extends beyond participation, influencing relationships, governance, and the distribution of power between genders.